You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, Donald Trump is set for a really bad day in trial. So we're going to talk about the first opportunity that prosecutors have to expose Trump's misconduct to the jury. But first, just a reminder to those watching right now that Glenn and I will be doing comprehensive daily coverage of the Trump trial. So if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to our channels are on this screen. They're also in the post description of this video. Okay, Glenn, talk about these acts of misconduct that the jury is going to hear about. What is this process that we're going to be seeing carry out right now?
Yeah, so they're going to hold what's called a Sandoval hearing. What does that mean? So every jurisdiction has its own name for these kind of hearings. Usually the name comes from the leading appellate court case. And in New York, the defendant was named Sandoval when the appellate court decided a case that gave birth to this kind of a hearing. So it is forever known as the Sandoval hearing. What is it? So when a defendant is trying to make the decision whether he wants to testify or decline to testify in his own criminal trial, the prosecutors have to give the defense notice of all the acts of uncharged misconduct. I'll talk more about that in a minute. That's a bit of a mouthful. All of the acts of uncharged misconduct that they might want to cross-examine the defendant with to give the jury information about the defendant's credibility. So, what are acts of uncharged misconduct? In this case, Donald Trump is charged with 34 felony counts of falsifying business records to cover up the true nature of hush money payments to gain unfair advantage in a presidential election. However, Donald Trump has engaged in so much more misconduct, even in recent years, for which he's been held accountable in various courts. And so under the New York state law, if Donald Trump testifies, this jury gets to hear that an earlier jury found him liable for assaulting and defaming a couple of times over, E. Jean Carroll, and that he was ordered to pay millions and millions in damages to E. Jean Carroll. And Brian, I have the Sandoval notice here, and there are 13 acts of misconduct by Donald Trump that the prosecutors want to introduce to the jury when they are cross-examining Donald Trump. There was when the Trump Corporation, really the Trump Organization, but it was called the Trump Corporation, was convicted of 17 felonies for long-term systemic business fraud. They want to cross-examine him about that. They want to cross-examine him about how there were illegal fundraisers held for Donald Trump, and the money was supposed to go to the Trump charity, and instead it was diverted to his campaign. They then want to ask him about the fact that Donald Trump stipulated to, that is, he agreed to dissolve the Trump charity as a way to sort of settle all of the fraud that had been involved there. And Brian, it goes on and on and on. 13 other acts of uncharged misconduct or crimes by Donald Trump that the prosecutors want to cross-examine Donald Trump with in the event Donald Trump takes the stand in his own trial. So this is an exercise where they go through all of these acts of misconduct. The judge will decide which ones are properly the subject of cross-examination and which ones, for example, might be too prejudicial for the prosecutors to bring up. And then once that issue is decided, then Donald Trump gets to make the decision. Okay, I know that the jury is going to learn of 10 acts of serious misconduct, including lying under oath in another court. That's going to factor into my decision as to whether I actually want to take the stand in my own defense at my criminal trial.
So to be clear, if he opts not to take the stand in his own defense, is it that prosecutors won't be able to introduce any of this uncharged misconduct?
They will only be able to introduce the uncharged misconduct that they litigated previously and that the judge ruled was appropriately admissible evidence, but it will be a much narrower scope of uncharged misconduct than if Donald Trump ends up taking the stand.
And do you believe that this will have any impact on Trump's willingness to actually take the stand? Or do you think he's already made that decision up anyway?
I don't think Donald Trump can take the stand for a New York minute without lying, committing perjury. And, you know, his lies are so transparent when he tells them. I don't think there's any chance he was going to take the stand even before getting this Sandoval notice, which is devastating. If the jurors are presented with 13 instances of serious misconduct by Donald Trump, do you really think they're going to give him the benefit of the doubt when it comes time to judge his guilt of the 34 falsifying business records crimes for which he's been indicted in this case?
Glenn, is there any reason that Donald Trump might opt to actually take the stand and testify here, or does he actually stand to benefit more from just sitting down and shutting up the entire time?
Yeah, Brian, he has the right to remain silent. I don't think Donald Trump has the ability to remain silent, but I think his attorneys will recommend to him in the strongest possible terms that it's not going to inure to your advantage if you take the stand in this case. Now, listen, Donald Trump may be so full of himself that he thinks he can win over the jurors. And remember, he only has to win over one juror. If he wins over one juror with his bluff and his bluster and his bull on the stand, well, then that could result in a hung jury and a mistrial. The good news is if the jury hangs, in other words, if they can't decide the case unanimously, either for guilt or not guilty, acquittal, then the prosecutors can retry it. And let me tell you, I did a lot of retrials in my years. Ordinarily, prosecutors fine-tune their presentation of the evidence, and the retrial goes a little bit better and often will result in a conviction even after the first case hung.
And we've spoken about the prospect of a hung jury before, but just for posterity here, for those who are just watching this for the first time, would a retrial happen immediately? What would the timing of that look like?
A retrial would almost certainly be pushed off into the future, at least a month, 2 months, 3 months, because, judges actually stack up their trials. So I can promise you, as soon as the Trump trial is over, Judge Merchan probably has 3 other trials that are in the chute and ready to go, just waiting for the Trump trial to conclude. It doesn't mean that in this case, which is really unique, right, a former president of the United States who interfered in the 2016 election to get elected, and he's running for presidency again. I mean, I think time is of the essence, and the American people deserve to know if he ends up being the nominee for the Republican Party, whether they're going to the polls and casting their vote for a convicted felon or for a fully innocent, exonerated man. So I think there's an off chance that Judge Merchan will say, listen, I'll give you a week or two, but if the jury hangs, we're going right back in to a retrial because we need to resolve this case.
Well, do you think the fact that also this jury selection process seems to be going whip fast, and also Judge Merchan likely gave himself some padding? I mean, this is a major trial. It's probably the biggest trial, one of the biggest trials that's ever happened in American history. Chances are he didn't butt this up right against, his very next trial with only like a day or two to spare. So I'm assuming he gave himself a little bit of cushion. So in the event that there is a hung jury, do you imagine that they would be able, given how quickly the jury selection is happening, and also some cushion that he may have given himself at the end, that we could see an immediate retrial?
I would say a possibility, but not a likelihood. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that anytime you're getting ready to go to trial, you have to go out and subpoena all of the witnesses for the new trial date. You have to coordinate with their schedules. I mean, everybody's got their lives to live, and so it really is a Herculean task to get everybody back together to go right back into a retrial. Not impossible. I just don't see it as all that likely.
All right. Well, obviously, everybody's doing everything they can to make sure the trial worked correctly the first time, and that's what we'll continue to follow along with. So for those watching right now, if you want to follow along with everything that happens in this first Trump prosecution as it continues to progress, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. You can hover your mouse right over both of the links to our channels and just hit the subscribe button. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.